The internet is packed with videos trying to help you solve the problem of sympathetic resonance that's making your snare drum go crazy. None of them hit it out of the park. So today, we want to give you actionable tools for whatever the cause of this issue is in your case. Sometimes when we talk about issues in the sound of the kit, we're trying to mitigate how frustrating or how real the issue really is. And the fact is, this is really frustrating. It can drive us super crazy, and depending on the source of the problem, it can actually be really problematic. So let's get into this, let's figure out where it's coming from, and see what we can do to mitigate the issue. The big blind spot that we see in studying other people's approaches to this problem is that there are many sources of this issue of having the wires going crazy when you're trying to play. And they are not mutually exclusive. You could be experiencing 2 or 3 or 4 of them at the same time. And if you go for a single solution and it doesn't work, where does that leave you? You're still in trouble. Today, we're going to break this down into 3 sections. We're going to talk about equipment. We're going to talk about tuning possible fixes, and we're going to discuss the circumstances in which you're playing that could be contributing to this issue. First stop in the equipment realm is overarching in the drum world, and it is this race toward maximum sustain and resonance in drums that started somewhere in the 70s and has only accelerated as time has gone on. Whether we're talking about isolation mounts for your rack toms, isolation for your snare drum, all of these things are giving us more sustain, they're giving us bigger notes, bigger resonance, and that is actually the thing that is causing, often, this crazy noise between the rack tom in particular and the snare drum. The first stop on this is to see what in your equipment is built-in design to make your drums ring more. Something that we do here often, as we're doing right now, is placing our rack tom on a snare stand. This gives us the option of, frankly, clamping down the stand on the lower hoop, which will shorten the sustain of the drum and oftentimes is the solution for us here when we're running into this issue. If that seems nuts, well, oftentimes the word choking we're using it as a negative, but in this case, if the rack tom is giving us too much sonic information and the snare drum can't handle it, we need to choke it out a little bit. And I don't always want to do that with muffling or with a different head or some kind of invasive procedure. I just put it on a snare stand all the time, and then I have an adjustment at my fingertips. Another thing to consider is the size of your rack toms, and by virtue of that, how much ringing you're getting out of it. Smaller rack toms tend to exacerbate this problem with snare drums, and larger rack toms tend to have just a lower overall fundamental sound that doesn't hit the snare quite as hard. For instance, hit your rack tom and see what happens, and then hit your floor tom and see what happens. Very rarely, if ever, are you getting the same amount of rattle out of the snare between those 2 sizes. The simple solution here is to experiment with different drums if it's an option, or consider that maybe you're going to need to adjust the tuning, which we'll get to later. Moving to the snare drum, we need to address the sort of wires that we have on the drum because depending on what we're using, we may need to experiment with some other options. Now, we're not saying that you can't use ultra-wide wires. I'm sure that's the first thing that a lot of people are thinking. This is not an anti-wide wires, sentiment that we're trying to say here. However, you need to check under the drum on the stand. Just give the slightest little touch to the outer wires and make sure that they're in contact with the head, because there are a lot of drums where the snare beds are not designed in a way to facilitate ultra-wide wires. Additionally, using narrower wires is going to give us a more focused snare sound than ultra-wides, and they're going to work on a lot bigger variety of drums without even risking the possibility that we could have an issue in this way. For anyone worried about the loss of snare response by moving to narrower wires, we made a video a little while back where we took some ultra wides and meticulously removed wires from the outside until I think we ended up with 4 or maybe 2 wires. We really started to experience a loss in snare response way after it was going to matter. Like 20's enough. And as a side note, we here have often experienced excessive snare, rattle, and buzz from the rack tom when the wires were damaged. If there are bent wires, if they don't tension up evenly when you apply the snare mechanism, just take a look at your wires, and if there's any doubt at all, replace them. Even like inexpensive wires will do. Just something fresh to see if that could be the problem. And if it is, then you don't need to adjust anything. All right, that's enough about equipment. Let's talk about the tuning side of things. Culprit number 1, super tight snare side head. Honestly, the physics of this doesn't really matter. I'm just going to tell you, if you were experiencing this problem, try taking a quarter turn, half turn, whatever you want. Just lower the snare side head tension a little bit. And if the head's been cranked for a long time, bite the bullet, replace it, and don't crank it right out of the gate. Experiment with small increments, raising that tension, and check out both the snare sound and the crosstalk from the tom as you go. If you're enjoying what you're seeing here today, please follow the link below and join our Patreon. It is the best way possible to help us continue to make these episodes, do these experiments, and play a lot of drums. We've also run into some shenanigans with the rack tom, and specifically the interval between the heads resulting in a pitch or a range or a behavior that made the snare go super crazy. I don't want you to start from scratch with tuning your rack tom. All I want you to do is, assuming that we're happy with the sound that we have, consider adjusting the tension of the reso up a little bit or down a little bit, listening to the snare sound for the duration. And when I say the snare sound, I specifically mean that crosstalk, because it's entirely possible that a fraction of a turn up or down on the reso is going to fully stop this problem. It's happened here lots of times, small fix, and it's not going to change the sound of the rack tom enough to, well, bother me anyway. When we're making changes, especially in tuning to try to alleviate these problems, assuming that we're starting with sounds that are making us happy, we're gonna dip into some kind of sacrifice. And one that I will go to in a pinch is the age-old thing of detuning 1 or 2 lugs on the rack tom that are closest to the drum that I'm having the crosstalk issue with, in this case, the snare drum. This is a real-world fix. It definitely works. It will change the sound of the rack tom to some degree. You can experiment with doing this to the reso only, or the batter only, or both. This is another one where if you do, a certain amount on them and you don't like it, you can just put it back and you'll be okay. So don't be afraid to do this. It seems crazy, uneven tensioning, but it does work. There's a reason why everybody does this, and it's definitely my first one-stop shop if I don't have time to experiment. We've also got an awful lot of people saying that the quick fix to this is to detune the tension rods that are adjacent to the wires underneath the snare. You can try it. I have not gotten good results from this particular fix. I prefer to raise and lower the tension of the rest of them and leave the ones next to the wires the same. And for me, usually lowering the ones that are not adjacent to the wires will elicit more rattly snare sound, and tightening them up will bring everything into focus. And for me, this is a little bit of the way that I EQ the snare side head to get the snare response that I need in a given situation. Now, if you're cranking your snare side right out of the gate, you may not have much tuning wiggle room on these outer lugs to raise them to have this effect. So this is another one in the bin of let's not crank that head so that we have these options and aren't limited to maybe relaxing the tension right next to the wires. Because frankly, in that case, you're risking those falling out while you're playing anyway, especially if you take more than a little tension off of them. We also should mention that the pitch relationship between the snare's fundamental pitch and the rack tom's fundamental pitch can sometimes be too friendly. They get along really well. This drum is making that one sing, this one's making this one sing. And this is less about the range that they're tuned in together and more about how they're interacting. So if you're coming along and you're tuning up your drums and you're trying to figure out how to get them to talk to each other a little less, taking one or the other of them and collectively raising or lowering the whole tuning of that drum is an option. Again, if we are optimizing for a certain sound and we're happy with that sound, then raising or lowering the whole pitch of one of the drums is going to take us away from that. But that's also an opportunity for experimentation, and I've run into this being an issue in very high tunings and very low tunings on both of them. So take it as an opportunity to learn about your drums, and bear in mind that with a little bit of practice, you can get back to where you were. So, never forget that. It should also go without saying that you should really experiment with the tension that your wires are under. Try tightening them a little, try loosening them a little, make sure you're not choking them out, and make sure that they're not rattling because they're coming loose while you're playing. There are a fair amount of mechanisms out there that will work loose while you hit. We have past videos about ways to work with that as well. Check those out. But if the wires are too loose, none of this is going to matter. Moving on, circumstances and context. Let's forget about the drums for a second, and let's talk about the room that you're in. What is the floor made out of? How high is the ceiling? How big is the room? Are your drums in the corner of the room? Is your seat in the corner of the room? How long is the room? What other stuff is in the room? Every single one of these things affects what we're talking about here, which is why I can't hit these two drums and say, just tune them like this and then you'll be fine, because you won't. You have to experiment in the context that you're in with your drums. That's the only way to figure this out. This is not a quick fix one, because unless we swap out the room or swap out the drums, there isn't really a handy dandy solution. This is about learning how your drums work and also learning how your room works and then working within the confines of that. And boy, it just takes a little bit of time. There is the option in this scenario of trying setting up your drums elsewhere in the room or orienting them differently. These can have pretty big effects, but there will be limitations because the physics of a room is the physics of that room. You can do baffling and different things, if we've done some things like that here, but you do have to understand the limitations of the space and then work within them. This one's for people that are either rehearsing with a sound system or possibly playing live shows. And this is going a few steps ahead, but it's something that I've experienced a few times. Some of my friends that do louder, bigger stages, this starts to be an issue. It's the factor of your drums are mic'd and they're coming out of your monitor because where you are, you need that added reinforcement of sound. If your rack tom is coming out of a speaker on the floor and hitting directly into your snare drum, it's gonna go crazy no matter what you do. So there are options for maybe having those monitors EQ'd so that there's a little less low end in them, or you can experiment with different tunings. I, for one, generally speaking, don't put toms in my monitor, even if I'm on the sort of stage where that's appropriate and the sound engineer is asking me if I want that. I'll put kick in there. It's a short sound. It doesn't really get in the snare. But consider that anywhere that this sound is coming from is also going to be a factor. Never mind whatever else is coming out of that speaker as well. It should also be noted that the physical proximity of the drums is going to affect how they interact. Now, there isn't really an option for me to take this rack tom and put it like 5 feet away, but it's something to think about when you're setting up your kit, because there are certain limitations to what we can get away with when we have multiple resonating instruments this close to each other. And there's an amount of snare wire rattle that I consider to be reasonable and acceptable. And the proximity of it is frankly why we're experiencing this. And we goofed off with this a little bit here and moved the drums around and stuff. But consider that anytime we're taking a bunch of instruments that are resonating and we're hitting them close to each other, they're going to talk to each other to some degree. There's going to be crosstalk. And this is less about ending that and making it sound like samples and more about mitigating it so that we can have a good time playing. Now we've arrived at the final chapter here, expectations versus reality. What can we really expect out of these acoustic instruments? This is the ultimate blind spot in all of this, and it's because we are used to hearing recorded drums that have had a tremendous amount of things done to them in terms of processing. They may not even be real drum sounds by the time we hear them. Marrying ourselves to the reality of what acoustic drums do to each other when we hit them is going to help us get away from this pie-in-the-sky idea that we can have this perfect, in a vacuum, drum sound like each of these are in a different room, and instead move toward the idea that this is a bunch of instruments that constitute one instrument, and some of the best parts of it are the way that they interact with each other. There are plenty of opportunities to hear in recordings and live the natural sound of drums. It's either recordings where the band and the musicians want that kind of sound, or perhaps in a live situation where you're so close to the drums in a small club or something that you're hearing the actual acoustic sound of them. And it's really just in our best interest to make sure that we understand what we can expect from acoustic drums and then work within that and utilize muffling and whatever else you want to do, but understand that these are real acoustic instruments. They're alive and we need to learn how to interact with them. Let's face it, nobody wants a ton of crazy noise coming out of their snare drum when they play their drums, no matter the source of the issue. Hopefully what we ran through today is going to help you mitigate this issue that we're never going to get all the way away from, but we can definitely do a lot to get it into a level that is acceptable, that doesn't bug us too much, and that also allows us to tune our drums in a way that makes us happy so that frankly, we want to play.